Science has given us miraculous discoveries and life-changing innovations, but sometimes the pursuit of knowledge comes at an unthinkable cost. Tonight, we're exploring the darkest corners of scientific history, where experiments designed to help humanity instead left trails of destruction, suffering, and death. In the decades following the Second World War, a plutonium sphere sat in a laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, waiting. Scientists had given it a playful name at first, calling it Rufus, but after it claimed its first victim, that name would be forgotten. Instead, it would earn a far more sinister title, one that would echo through the halls of nuclear physics for generations to come. The core was about the size of a softball, weighing just over 6 kilograms, and it glowed faintly with an otherworldly warmth. To look at it, you wouldn't think it was particularly dangerous. It sat there on a laboratory bench, unassuming in its metal casing, waiting for someone to make a mistake. And on a late summer night in 1945, someone finally did. Harry Daghlian was 24 years old, brilliant and cautious by nature. He'd been working at Los Alamos since 1944, while still a graduate student, joining the critical assembly group that was tasked with some of the most delicate and dangerous work of the Manhattan Project. The war with Japan had just ended, and there was a strange mix of relief and purposelessness hanging over the laboratory. The bomb that this plutonium core was meant to become would never be needed. Japan had surrendered after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this third weapon, already assembled and ready, would remain unused. But the work at Los Alamos continued. Scientists needed to understand exactly how close they could bring fissile material to criticality without triggering a chain reaction. It was delicate work, the kind that required patience and precision, and it was work that should never have been done alone. But on the evening of August 21st, 1945, Harry Daghlian returned to the laboratory after dinner to continue his experiments. A security guard named Private Robert Hemmerly sat at a desk about 10 to 12 feet away, there more as a formality than anything else. He wasn't a scientist. He wouldn't know what to do if something went wrong. He was simply there, watching, as Daghlian worked with the core. The experiment was straightforward in concept, though terrifyingly dangerous in execution. Daghlian was building a neutron reflector around the plutonium core, carefully stacking tungsten carbide bricks around it like a fortress wall. Each brick he added pushed the core closer to criticality. The tungsten carbide reflected neutrons back into the plutonium, and when enough neutrons stayed in the core instead of escaping, the chain reaction would begin. Daghlian had a neutron counter monitoring the core, its clicks growing faster and more urgent with each brick he placed. He was working methodically, brick by brick, watching the counter, calculating in his head how close he was getting to the edge. The counter was telling him something important now, warning him that placing another brick would push the assembly past the point of no return. The core would go supercritical. So Daghlian stopped. He began to pull back, to remove a brick, to create distance between himself and disaster. But as he moved the brick away, it slipped from his fingers. Perhaps his hand was sweaty from the late summer heat. Perhaps the angle was awkward. Perhaps it was simply bad luck. Whatever the reason, the brick fell. And it fell directly onto the top of the core. In an instant, the neutron counter screamed. The core went supercritical, achieving a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. A blue flash filled the room, and a wave of heat washed over Daghlian's body. He later described feeling a tingling sensation in his hands, the first indication that his cells were being bombarded with deadly radiation. Daghlian moved quickly. He grabbed the brick with his bare hands and pulled it off the core, stopping the reaction within seconds. But the damage was already done. In those few seconds, he had been exposed to a massive dose of radiation, far beyond what any human body could withstand. Private Hemmerly, sitting just 10 feet away, had also been exposed, though to a much lesser degree. He would survive, though he would carry that radiation with him for the rest of his life. But for Daghlian, sitting right next to the core when it went critical, there was no hope. In the days that followed, Daghlian allowed doctors to document every stage of his deterioration. He knew he was going to die, and he wanted his death to mean something, to contribute to scientific knowledge about radiation sickness. The documentation is clinical and horrifying in equal measure. His right hand, the one that had grabbed the brick, began to blister. The nails turned blue, the skin reddened and began to swell, and then both hands and his abdomen started to expand grotesquely. The redness spread across his body like a slow-moving fire. His skin began to slough off in layers, falling away to reveal raw, bleeding tissue underneath. He was plagued by abdominal cramps and uncontrollable diarrhea. He grew emaciated as his body consumed itself from the inside. By the time he slipped into a coma, he had lost most of the skin on his abdomen and lower chest. His death certificate would list the cause as severe burns to the upper extremities and trunk. But everyone knew what had really killed him. The plutonium core had destroyed him at a cellular level. 25 days after the accident, on September 15th, 1945, Harry Daghlian died. He was the first person to die from acute radiation poisoning in the history of nuclear physics. But he would not be the last victim of that particular plutonium core. The core, which had been playfully called Rufus before the accident, was no longer spoken of with any affection. Some started calling it the Demon Core, a name that would stick after it claimed its second victim 9 months later. Louis Slotin was a different sort of scientist from Harry Daghlian. Born in Winnipeg, Canada, to Jewish immigrants who had fled the pogroms of Russia, Slotin had a reputation for being brilliant, charismatic, and dangerously bold. He'd earned degrees in biochemistry and had come to Los Alamos in 1944, where he quickly established himself as an expert in handling fissile materials. He'd been the one to physically assemble the plutonium core for the Trinity test, the first nuclear weapon ever detonated. His hands had put together the device that ushered in the atomic age. But Slotin had a habit that worried his colleagues. He had a tendency toward what some might call showmanship, a willingness to take risks that others wouldn't. And nowhere was this more apparent than in his demonstrations of criticality experiments, which scientists had nicknamed tickling the dragon's tail. The phrase came from physicist Richard Feynman, who understood that what they were doing was deliberately provoking a reaction, dancing right up to the edge of disaster and then pulling back at the last second. The experiment Slotin performed regularly was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its danger. He would place the demon core on a table and then lower 2 half-spheres of beryllium around it. Beryllium is a neutron reflector, just like the tungsten carbide bricks that had killed Daghlian. As the beryllium hemispheres closed around the core, more and more neutrons would be reflected back into the plutonium, pushing it toward criticality. The trick was to keep the hemispheres from closing completely. Slotin did this by holding the upper hemisphere with his left hand and using a screwdriver blade to maintain a tiny gap between the 2 halves. By twisting the screwdriver, he could adjust the size of the gap, watching his instruments as the neutron count rose and fell. It was precise work, requiring a steady hand and constant attention. Standard protocol called for using shims metal spacers to keep the hemispheres apart. But Slotin had developed his own method, one that was faster and more dramatic. He would perform the experiment with just the screwdriver, often in his signature blue jeans and cowboy boots, standing in front of a room full of observers. He'd done it successfully almost a dozen times. Enrico Fermi, one of the most respected physicists of the era, had watched Slotin perform this trick and told him bluntly that he and anyone else who continued doing it would be dead within a year. Fermi understood the mathematics of probability. You could get away with this kind of risk once, twice, maybe even 10 times. But eventually, your luck would run out. Eventually, that screwdriver would slip. On May 21st, 1946, Louis Slotin stood in a laboratory at Los Alamos with 7 colleagues watching him. Among them was a man named Alvin Graves, who stood directly behind Slotin, watching over his shoulder. The others were positioned around the room at varying distances. Slotin had performed this demonstration many times before, and there was no particular reason to think this time would be any different. But as Slotin adjusted the screwdriver, it slipped. Just a fraction of an inch, but that was all it took. The upper hemisphere dropped, closing completely around the core for a split second. The demon core achieved supercriticality for the second time in 9 months. Everyone in the room saw it. A blue flash of light, brilliant and terrible, filled the laboratory. Raymer Schreiber, one of the observers, later wrote that the flash was clearly visible, even though the room was well lit from windows and overhead lights. The entire event lasted less than a second. Slotin reacted immediately, using his bare hands to knock the upper hemisphere away from the core, stopping the reaction. But just as with Daghlian, the damage had been done in those few fractions of a second. Slotin knew instantly what had happened. He reported an immediate sour taste in his mouth and a burning sensation in his left hand, the hand he'd used to separate the hemispheres. As he was rushed to the hospital, he began vomiting. His colleagues tried to calculate how much radiation he'd received, but none of them had been wearing their dosimetry badges that day, so the measurements were all estimates. What they did know was that Slotin had absorbed approximately 1,000 rads of radiation, well above a lethal dose. Graves, standing directly behind Slotin, had been partially shielded by Slotin's body and received a high but non-lethal dose. The others in the room received varying amounts depending on their distance from the core. But for Slotin, there was no hope of survival. He would live for 9 days, and those 9 days would be agony. The deterioration of Louis Slotin's body followed a similar pattern to Harry Daghlian's, but the progression was faster. His hands swelled massively, the fingers turning into bloated, painful appendages. Massive blisters erupted across his skin. His body developed gangrene. The doctors documented what one report called a total disintegration of bodily functions. His organs began to fail one by one. He suffered severe diarrhea, and his internal systems simply stopped working as the radiation destroyed his cells faster than his body could replace them. Perhaps the cruelest part was that Slotin remained conscious and lucid for most of those 9 days. He knew exactly what was happening to him, understood the biological processes that were destroying him from the inside out. His mother and father traveled from Winnipeg to be with him in his final days, and his father later told doctors that Louis had been a scientist all his life, and that when it could do him no harm, it would be wrong to prevent him from adding to knowledge. He gave permission for an autopsy to be performed, even though it went against the family's traditions. On May 30th, 1946, Louis Slotin died. He was 35 years old. His funeral in Winnipeg was one of the largest the city had ever seen. Thousands of people lined the streets outside the family home on Scotia Street, unable to fit inside. The rabbi called him one of Winnipeg's most distinguished sons. But for many of those who had worked with him at Los Alamos, there was an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Had Slotin's death been a tragic accident, or had it been the inevitable result of unnecessary risk-taking? Following Slotin's death, Los Alamos immediately halted all hands-on criticality experiments. From that point forward, all such work would be done remotely, with machines and thick barriers separating scientists from radioactive materials. The era of tickling the dragon's tail was over. As for the Demon Core itself, it was scheduled to be used in the third test of Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, a nuclear weapons test series. But after the second criticality accident, officials decided the core needed time to cool down, both literally and figuratively. By the time that cooling period was over, the planned test had been canceled. The Demon Core that had killed 2 men would never be used for its intended purpose. Instead, in the summer of 1946, it was melted down and recast into new weapons. 3 of the 7 men who had been in the room with Slotin that day eventually died of conditions that could have been related to their radiation exposure. Alvin Graves died of a heart attack 20 years later at age 55. Another developed acute myeloid leukemia 19 years later and died at age 42. A third died of aplastic anemia and bacterial infection 29 years later at age 83. Whether these deaths were directly caused by their exposure to the Demon Core remains a subject of medical debate. But there's no debate about the fates of Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin. The Demon Core killed them slowly and painfully, teaching the nuclear physics community a lesson written in suffering about the terrible price of working at the edge of the possible. Years later, when scientists and historians looked back on the Demon Core incidents, they saw them not just as tragic accidents, but as pivotal moments in the development of safety culture in nuclear science. The Demon Core forced the scientific community to confront an uncomfortable truth. Brilliance and knowledge weren't enough to protect you from the consequences of poor safety practices. Individual heroism, like Slotin's quick reaction to pull apart the hemispheres, couldn't undo the damage of a split-second mistake. And no discovery, no matter how important, was worth the kind of suffering that Daghlian and Slotin endured in their final days. The story of the Demon Core serves as a dark reminder that sometimes the monsters we create in the laboratory don't look like monsters at all. Sometimes they're just a softball-sized sphere of metal, warm to the touch, glowing faintly in the dim light of a physics lab, waiting patiently for someone to make a mistake. In the autumn of 1999, an 18-year-old boy named Jesse Gelsinger traveled from his home in Tucson, Arizona, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with hope in his heart and trust in science. Jesse had lived his entire life with ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, a rare genetic disorder that prevented his liver from properly processing ammonia, a toxic byproduct of protein breakdown. Most babies born with the severe form of this disease fall into comas within days and suffer catastrophic brain damage. Half of them die within a month. But Jesse had been lucky, if you could call it that. He had a milder form of the disease, something called somatic mosaicism, where only some of his cells carried the defective gene. His body could still produce some of the enzyme he needed, just not enough to function normally. So Jesse lived his life on a strict low-protein diet and took nearly 50 pills a day, a regimen that had kept him alive, but that required constant vigilance. By all accounts, Jesse was a sweet kid, sharp-witted, if not particularly ambitious, who loved motorcycles and professional wrestling. He worked part-time at a supermarket, attended high school, and lived with his parents and siblings. He'd learned to manage his condition. But as he got older and became more independent, he sometimes pushed back against the restrictions. Like many teenagers, he occasionally rebelled against having to take all those pills, against having to avoid foods that other kids could eat without thinking. These small acts of rebellion sometimes landed him in the hospital with dangerous spikes in his ammonia levels. But Jesse had also developed a sense of purpose about his condition. He knew that babies born with the severe form of his disease usually died, and he wanted to help change that. So when he learned about a clinical trial at the University of Pennsylvania that was testing a potential gene therapy treatment for his condition, he jumped at the chance to participate. The trial wasn't designed to help him directly. The researchers were clear about that. This was a safety study, meant to test whether the treatment could eventually be used to help newborns with the severe form of the disease. But Jesse was eager to contribute to something that might save other children in the future. In September 1999, Jesse flew to Philadelphia to take part in the trial. He was the 18th person to receive the treatment. The procedure involved injecting a modified virus carrying a corrected copy of the gene he lacked directly into his hepatic artery, the blood vessel that feeds the liver. The virus was an adenovirus, a type of virus that causes the common cold, but it had been genetically modified to be harmless and to carry the therapeutic gene. Previous participants in the trial had experienced flu-like symptoms, but nothing serious. The researchers expected Jesse to have a similar response. On September 13th, Jesse received the injection. Within hours, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Jesse became disoriented and developed jaundice, his skin and eyes turning yellow as his liver began to fail. His body was mounting a catastrophic immune response to the virus, an inflammatory reaction so severe that it triggered a dangerous blood clotting disorder. His organs began to fail one by one, first his liver, then his kidneys, then his lungs. The medical team worked frantically to save him, but nothing they tried could stop the cascade of system failures. Jesse was placed on a ventilator as his lungs stopped functioning. His body swelled with fluid. By the third day, he was in a coma. The doctors knew there was no way to reverse what was happening. His body was destroying itself from the inside, and they could only watch. On September 17, 1999, 4 days after receiving the experimental treatment, Jesse Gelsinger was taken off life support. He died at 2:30 in the afternoon, surrounded by his family. He had come to Philadelphia hoping to help save the lives of babies with his condition. Instead, he became the first person publicly identified as having died in a gene therapy clinical trial. In the days and weeks following Jesse's death, the story of what had happened began to unravel, and what investigators found was deeply troubling. The problems with the trial went far beyond an unexpected reaction to the treatment. The entire study, it turned out, had been plagued by conflicts of interest, poor oversight, and a failure to properly inform participants about the risks they were taking. The lead investigator, Dr. James Wilson, director of the Institute for Human Gene Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania, had significant financial interests in the research. He owned stock in a company called Genovo that was funding the institute and stood to benefit financially if the gene therapy proved successful. This created a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed to participants, but wasn't made clear to Jesse or his family. More troubling still, The researchers had withheld critical information from Jesse and other participants. Several patients in earlier stages of the trial had experienced serious side effects, including severe liver reactions, but this information was not adequately communicated to Jesse. In animal testing prior to the human trials, monkeys given similar treatments had died from blood clotting disorders and severe liver inflammation. Jesse was never told about these deaths. Even more damning, Jesse should never have been included in the trial at all. His ammonia levels were elevated when he arrived in Philadelphia, which according to the study's own protocols should have excluded him from participation. But the researchers went ahead with the treatment anyway. Jesse had replaced another volunteer who had dropped out, and rather than waiting for another appropriate candidate, they used Jesse, despite his ammonia levels being too high. The FDA investigation that followed Jesse's death uncovered numerous violations of research protocols. The University of Pennsylvania and the research team were found to have failed in their most basic obligations to protect research participants. The informed consent documents Jesse had signed were inadequate and misleading. The monitoring of adverse events in the trial had been insufficient. The oversight of the research was fundamentally flawed. Jesse's father, Paul Gelsinger, was devastated. He had supported his son's decision to participate in the trial, believing that the researchers had Jesse's best interests at heart and that the risks were minimal. Now he learned that the study had been riddled with problems from the start. He retained a lawyer named Alan Milstein, who characterized the trial as an example of everything that could go wrong when financial incentives and inadequate oversight combined in medical research. The lawsuit that followed was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The University of Pennsylvania agreed to improve its oversight of human subject research, but admitted no wrongdoing in Jesse's death. Dr. Wilson was barred from conducting human research for 5 years and paid a settlement to the federal government. The Institute for Human Gene Therapy at the University of Pennsylvania was eventually shut down. The impact of Jesse's death rippled through the entire field of gene therapy. All gene therapy trials in the United States were temporarily halted while safety protocols were reviewed. The FDA implemented new monitoring requirements, including mandating disclosure of financial conflicts of interest before trials begin rather than after they conclude. The rules around informed consent were strengthened, making it clearer that researchers must disclose all known risks, including results from animal studies and adverse events in other human participants. But perhaps the most significant impact was on public perception of gene therapy itself. The field, which had been building momentum through the 1990s, suddenly faced intense skepticism. Funding dried up. Biotech companies focused on gene therapy shut down, promising research ground to a halt. For more than a decade, the field of gene therapy struggled to recover from the reputational damage caused by Jesse's death. Critics of medical research pointed to the Gelsinger case as emblematic of larger problems. Osagie Obasogie, a professor of bioethics, wrote in 2009 that contrary to hopes that Jesse's death would spur reform, oversight had actually flattened. Profit motives had become more entrenched in medical research, and the pool of potential human subjects had increasingly focused on vulnerable populations. The lessons learned from Jesse's death, he argued, were being forgotten even as the field moved forward with new treatments. And yet, despite the tragedy, gene therapy as a field has eventually recovered and even thrived. Today, gene therapies are successfully treating conditions that were once considered untreatable. Children with rare genetic disorders are living normal lives thanks to treatments that would have been impossible without the kind of research that Jesse participated in. In 2024, the FDA approved the first CRISPR-based gene therapy for sickle cell anemia. Scientists have used gene therapy to restore vision to people with inherited blindness, to treat certain forms of cancer, and to address a growing list of genetic conditions. Dr. Wilson himself, after his period of exile from clinical research, returned to the field and has been involved in the development of several approved gene therapy products. In interviews, he has expressed regret over Jesse's death while maintaining that he could not have predicted such a severe reaction. He has argued that the tragedy, while devastating, ultimately led to improvements in safety protocols that have made gene therapy safer for everyone who comes after. But for Jesse's father, Paul, those improvements came too late for his son. He spent years traveling and speaking about what happened, trying to ensure that other families wouldn't have to go through what his family experienced. He advocated for stronger oversight of clinical trials, for clearer informed consent processes, and for removing financial conflicts of interest from medical research. His message was simple. Research subjects are not means to an end. They are human beings who trust that researchers will put their safety first. When that trust is betrayed, people die. Jesse Gelsinger's case remains a cautionary tale taught in medical ethics courses around the world. It's invoked whenever conversations turn to the ethics of human experimentation, the dangers of conflicts of interest in research, and the importance of informed consent. His story is a reminder that even well-intentioned research, even work aimed at saving lives, can go horribly wrong when proper safeguards are not in place. The tragedy of Jesse's death is compounded by the fact that it was preventable. If the researchers had followed their own protocols, Jesse would never have been given the treatment that day. If they had been transparent about the risks, Jesse and his family might have made a different choice. If financial pressures hadn't influenced decision-making, perhaps more caution would have been exercised. If oversight had been stronger, perhaps someone would have caught the warning signs before it was too late. Jesse Gelsinger came to Philadelphia wanting to help save babies with his condition. In a tragic and twisted way, his death may have done exactly that. The reforms that followed his death have made gene therapy research safer, and the treatments being developed today are saving lives, including the lives of babies born with the severe form of ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency that Jesse had hoped to help treat. But that knowledge offers little comfort to a father who lost his son, or to anyone who understands that Jesse's death was not a necessary sacrifice for scientific progress. It was the result of failures that should never have happened. In the years just after World War I, a miraculous new substance captured the imagination of the American public. Radium, discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, glowed with an eerie green-blue light and was promoted as a wonder element with incredible health benefits. Advertisers claimed it could cure everything from arthritis to impotence. It was added to toothpaste, face creams, hair tonics, and even food products. Wealthy people paid fortunes for radium-infused water they believed would restore their youth and vitality. The element was seen not as dangerous, but as miraculous, a gift from modern science. This was the world that young women stepped into when they took jobs at radium dial factories beginning around 1917. The work was considered prestigious, clean, and well-paying. The factories were hiring women to paint watch dials, clock faces, aircraft instruments, and military equipment with radium-infused paint that glowed in the dark. These luminous dials were in high demand, particularly after the United States entered the First World War, and soldiers needed to read their watches and instruments in the trenches at night. The work required a steady hand and good eyesight to paint the tiny numbers on watch faces. The women who did this work were paid by the piece, and the fastest painters could earn astonishing wages for the time, sometimes more than triple what an average factory worker made. Some earned more than their fathers. The job was so desirable that entire families would try to get positions at the radium dial factories. The paint the women used was a mixture of radium dust, zinc sulfide, gum arabic, and water. When mixed properly, it created a luminous green-blue paste that glowed brilliantly. To ensure their brushes maintained a fine point for the detailed work, the women were instructed to use a technique called lip pointing. They would dip the brush in the paint, then place the tip of the brush between their lips and use their tongue to bring the bristles to a perfect point. It was a technique borrowed from China painting factories. The women would lip point the brush after every few strokes. A fast painter might put the brush in her mouth hundreds of times a day. The women were told the paint was completely harmless. After all, radium was being sold in consumer products across the country. Doctors were using it to treat cancer. It was considered therapeutic. The women had no reason to doubt this, and in fact, many of them thought the exposure to radium might even be good for them. They became known as the Ghost Girls because the radium dust made their skin, hair, and clothes glow in the dark. Some of the women would paint their nails, their lips, even their teeth with the radium paint before going out at night, delighting in how they would glow under ultraviolet light. The women didn't know what the owners and managers of the radium dial companies knew. The people running these factories understood that radium was dangerous. They took extensive precautions to protect themselves, using lead screens, masks, and tongs to handle the material. They never allowed radium dust to touch their skin. They certainly never put it in their mouths. But they told the women working on the factory floor that it was completely safe. By the early 1920s, women who had worked as radium dial painters began falling ill with mysterious symptoms. They complained of painful toothaches. Their teeth began falling out, and when dentists tried to extract the affected teeth, pieces of the women's jawbones would come out with the teeth. The extraction sites wouldn't heal. Instead, they would develop into painful, pus-filled ulcers. The condition spread through the jaw like a rot, the bone literally disintegrating. Dentists began seeing cases where they could remove a woman's entire jawbone with gentle pressure, the bone having become so brittle and porous that it crumbled like ash. Other symptoms followed. The women developed severe anemia, their bodies unable to produce enough blood cells. They suffered from bone fractures that occurred spontaneously, bones breaking under the weight of normal activities. They experienced debilitating joint pain. Their bones would develop massive sarcomas, aggressive bone cancers that riddled their skeletons. Some women became bedridden, their bones too weak to support their weight. Many lost the ability to walk. For some, the suffering would last for decades. One of the first to die was Amelia Molly Maggia, who had worked at the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation in Orange, New Jersey. It started with a toothache. Then another tooth needed to be removed. Soon her entire jaw was affected. The mysterious malady spread throughout Maggia's mouth and lower jaw, which had to be surgically removed. But the condition didn't stop there. It spread into other parts of her body. By the time she died in 1922, at age 24, her body was riddled with the effects of radiation poisoning, though no one understood that's what it was at the time. As more women became ill and died, the radium dial companies fought viciously to avoid responsibility. The United States Radium Corporation, one of the largest producers of radium dial paint, publicly denied that their paint had anything to do with the women's illnesses. They commissioned a study by an independent expert who confirmed that radium exposure was causing the workers' illnesses, and then they buried the report and commissioned new studies designed to contradict those findings. When the Department of Labor began investigating, company officials lied about what their own studies had found. The companies tried to blame the women themselves, suggesting that they suffered from syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that carried enormous social stigma at the time. They claimed the women were morally deficient, that their illnesses were the result of their own poor behavior and had nothing to do with the radium paint. They even claimed that they had hired people who were physically unfit to work elsewhere as an act of kindness, implying that the women had been sickly before they started working with radium. But doctors and dentists were starting to connect the dots. A dentist named Theodore Blum published an article in 1924, coining the term radium jaw to describe the condition he was seeing in dial painters. A pathologist named Harrison Martland developed tests that proved conclusively that the women had radium in their bodies at levels high enough to cause severe damage. The radium was accumulating in their bones, replacing calcium and irradiating their bodies from the inside. In 1927, 5 women who had worked at the United States Radium Corporation filed a lawsuit. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice, and they would become known as the Radium Girls. By the time their case went to court, all 5 women were gravely ill. Some were bedridden and couldn't raise their arms to take an oath. Their attorney had to explain to the judge that they couldn't appear in person because when you have been told you are going to die, that there is no hope, and every newspaper you pick up prints what amounts to your obituary, there is nothing else. The case attracted worldwide attention. Newspapers covered every development. The public was shocked by photographs of young women, many still in their 20s, who looked elderly and frail, their bodies destroyed by the radium they had been told was harmless. The United States Radium Corporation tried every legal maneuver they could to delay the trial, apparently hoping the women would die before the case could be resolved, and some of them did die during the legal proceedings. But the case was eventually settled out of court in 1928. Each of the 5 women was awarded $15,000 plus $600 per year for medical expenses, and the company agreed to cover the costs of any future medical treatment. By today's standards, adjusted for inflation, this amounts to roughly $250,000 each. It was a landmark case, one of the first times workers received compensation for an occupational disease. But the settlement came too late for many of the women. Within 2 years of receiving their compensation, most of them were dead. The story repeated itself in other locations. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company had assured its workers that their radium paint was pure, unlike the supposedly contaminated paint used in New Jersey. They told the women not to worry. But the women in Illinois started showing the same symptoms. Their teeth fell out, their bones broke, they developed cancers, and once again, the company fought to avoid responsibility. A woman named Catherine Wolfe Donahue became one of the leaders of the fight for justice in Illinois. By the time she sued the Radium Dial Company, she was too weak to attend court proceedings. She testified from a stretcher, her body ravaged by radium poisoning. Her case dragged on for years as the company appealed every ruling. Catherine died in July 1938 at age 35, but her legal victory came months later when the Illinois Supreme Court ruled in favor of the dial painters. The company had appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case, upholding the lower court's decision. These legal battles, fought by dying women who could barely move, transformed workplace safety law in America. The Illinois Occupational Diseases Act, passed in 1936, was a direct result of the Radium Girls' fight. It required employers to cover costs related to industrial poisoning. Other states followed with similar legislation. The federal government began taking workplace safety more seriously, eventually leading to the creation of agencies like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The practice of lip pointing was discontinued by the 1930s, and eventually radium-based paint was banned entirely in the 1960s. But for the women who had already been exposed, these changes came too late. The radium they had ingested in their teens and 20s continued to damage their bodies for the rest of their lives. Some women who had been stricken early endured decades of suffering. One woman was bedridden for 50 years. Many required multiple operations, amputations, and blood transfusions. Many died from bone cancer, leukemia, or severe anemia. Not all of the Radium Girls died young. Some, through chance or perhaps because they had ingested less radium than others, lived long lives. Mabel Williams, who worked at United States Radium Corporation at age 16, lived to be 104 years old. May Keene lived to be 107. But these survivors carried the legacy of radium in their bones for their entire lives, and they spent decades advocating for recognition and compensation for what had been done to them and their friends. The Radium Girls' story is one of exploitation, corporate negligence, and the terrible cost of prioritizing profit over human life. These were young women, many still teenagers, who were told that what they were doing was safe and even beneficial. They trusted their employers, trusted the scientists and doctors who assured them that radium was harmless. They had no reason to doubt these assurances. Radium was everywhere, in products marketed as health-promoting. How could they have known that the companies knew the truth and chose to hide it? The radium dial companies knew. Internal documents later revealed that they understood radium was dangerous as early as the 1920s. They had commissioned studies that proved it. They had watched their own chemists die from radium exposure. But they chose profit over transparency, chose to continue operations rather than warn their workers, chose to fight the dying women in court rather than accept responsibility. The Radium Girls fought back, and in doing so, they changed the world. Their legal battles established precedents that protect workers today. Their suffering led to regulations that require companies to prove their products are safe before they can be used. Their story became a cautionary tale about what happens when corporate interests are allowed to override concerns for human health and safety. Today, the sites of the old radium dial factories are contaminated. The building in Ottawa, Illinois, where the Radium Dial Company operated, was found to have radiation levels 1,666 times higher than what is considered safe. It was destroyed in 1968. The area around United States Radium Corporation's factory in New Jersey remains contaminated to this day, with ongoing cleanup efforts. And in cemeteries across the country, in Orange and Ottawa and other towns where radium dial factories once operated, some graves still glow faintly with radioactivity. The women buried there, the Radium Girls who painted with light and died glowing from within, remain radioactive even in death, their bones still emitting the radiation that killed them, a grim reminder of a time when science and industry conspired to sacrifice workers on the altar of profit. In the red earth of Macon County, Alabama, there stood in 1932 a crossroads where history, medicine, and the darkest impulses of institutional racism would intersect for 40 years. The men who lived in this county were sharecroppers, descendants of enslaved people who had traded one form of bondage for another. They worked land they didn't own, lived in poverty so deep it was hard to see any way out, and had virtually no access to medical care. Their lives were hard, their prospects dim, and most of them would die in the same circumstances they'd been born into. So when representatives from the United States Public Health Service arrived in Tuskegee in 1932, offering free medical care, hot meals, and burial insurance in exchange for participating in a medical study, hundreds of men signed up. They were told they would be examined and treated for bad blood, a local term that referred to a variety of ailments, including anemia, fatigue, and syphilis. The men were told they were fortunate to be receiving expert medical attention from government doctors, attention they could never have afforded on their own. What the men were not told was the truth. This was not a treatment program. It was the United States Public Health Service untreated syphilis study in the Negro male, and the entire purpose was to observe what happened when syphilis was left completely untreated, even unto death. The study began as a 6-month project proposed by Taliaferro Clark, head of the Public Health Service's Venereal Disease Section. The original plan was to document the effects of untreated syphilis in a group of African American men for a short period, and then treat them. But when the initial funding ran out, the decision was made to continue the study without treatment. The rationale was that here was an unparalleled opportunity to study the natural progression of the disease in a population that wouldn't otherwise receive treatment anyway. 600 men were enrolled in the study. 399 had latent syphilis, meaning they were infected but showed no symptoms at the time of enrollment. Another 201 men who did not have syphilis served as a control group. None of the men were told they had syphilis. None were told the true nature of the study. They were told only that they were receiving treatment for bad blood, and the treatments they received were placebos, aspirin, and vitamin supplements. Things that would do nothing to address the disease, slowly destroying their bodies. To ensure the men would continue participating in the study, the researchers offered incentives. Free medical examinations, though these examinations were more about documenting the disease's progression than helping the men. Hot meals on examination days, a significant benefit for men who often didn't have enough to eat. And perhaps most importantly, burial insurance. The researchers knew many of the men would die, and they wanted to ensure they could perform autopsies to study the full extent of the damage syphilis had done. The deception went deep. The men were given letters that referred to special free treatment, making them believe they were receiving something valuable. In reality, the special free treatment was often painful spinal taps performed to gather data about how the disease was affecting their nervous systems. The spinal taps were described to the men as treatments, not as diagnostic procedures that carried risks and provided no therapeutic benefit. As the years passed, the study continued. By 1943, penicillin had been identified as an effective treatment for syphilis. By the late 1940s, it had become the standard treatment, widely available and highly effective. But the men in the Tuskegee study were not offered penicillin. Researchers actively prevented them from receiving treatment. When the men tried to enlist in the military during World War II, which would have required treatment for syphilis, researchers intervened to keep them out of the service. When free syphilis treatment programs were established in the area, researchers worked to ensure the study participants were excluded. The men suffered and died. Syphilis is a progressive disease, In its later stages, it attacks the cardiovascular system and the nervous system. It causes severe pain, blindness, insanity, paralysis, and eventually death. Many of the men in the study watched their health deteriorate, not understanding that they had a treatable disease and that they were being deliberately denied treatment. Some went blind, some lost the ability to walk, some developed dementia, their minds deteriorating as the disease invaded their brains. The disease didn't stop with the men themselves. 40 of their wives became infected with syphilis, contracting the disease from their husbands who didn't know they were infected. 19 children were born with congenital syphilis, infected in the womb by mothers who had contracted the disease from their fathers. These children faced lifelong health problems or early death, the innocent victims of a study that valued scientific data over human life. And throughout it all, the study continued with the full knowledge and approval of multiple levels of government. Numerous doctors and researchers participated or knew about the study. Articles about the study were published in medical journals every 4 to 6 years, openly describing what was being done. The titles alone should have raised alarm. In 1964, an article in Archives of Internal Medicine was titled, "The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis, the 30th Year of Observation." This was not a secret study. It was being conducted openly with the implicit approval of the medical community. One man, a public health service investigator named Peter Buxton, raised concerns about the study in the mid-1960s. He wrote to his superiors pointing out that the study was ethically unjustified. In response, the Public Health Service convened a committee to review the study. That committee decided to continue the research. They saw no ethical problem with letting men suffer and die from a treatable disease so that researchers could gather data. Buxton tried again in 1968, writing another letter expressing his concerns. Again, nothing changed. Finally, frustrated by the lack of response, Buxton leaked information about the study to a reporter friend who passed it to Jean Heller of the Associated Press. On July 25, 1972, Heller broke the story to the world. The public response was immediate and outraged. An ad hoc advisory panel was quickly appointed to review the study. The panel concluded that the study was ethically unjustified, that the harm done to the participants far outweighed any scientific knowledge gained. On November 16, 1972, 40 years after it began, the Tuskegee Syphilis study was finally terminated. By that time, 28 of the original 400 men with syphilis had died directly from the disease. 100 more had died from complications related to syphilis. Of the 600 men originally enrolled, only 74 were still alive. The damage extended beyond just those numbers. 40 wives had been infected, 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, and the study had left a legacy of distrust that would persist in the African American community for generations. A class action lawsuit followed, settled out of court in 1974 for $10 million. The participants who were still alive received $37,500 each. The heirs of deceased participants received $15,000. In 1975, the government established the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program to provide lifetime medical care to the survivors, their wives, widows, and children affected by the study. But money and medical care couldn't undo what had been done. The Tuskegee study became a symbol of medical racism and government betrayal. It revealed that black bodies had been used as experimental subjects without consent, that the government had deliberately withheld life-saving treatment from black men, and that the medical establishment had been complicit in this for 40 years. The study's impact on medical ethics and research regulations was profound. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which required institutional review boards to approve all studies involving human subjects. The act established strict guidelines for informed consent, mandating that research participants must be told the true nature of studies they're asked to join, must understand the risks involved, and must give their voluntary consent without coercion. The Belmont Report, published in 1979, established 3 core principles for ethical research involving humans: respect for persons, meaning treating individuals as autonomous agents and protecting those with diminished autonomy; beneficence, meaning maximizing benefits and minimizing harm; and justice, meaning distributing the burdens and benefits of research fairly. These principles became the foundation for research ethics worldwide. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Tuskegee study is the deep mistrust it created between the African American community and the medical establishment. Studies have shown that the revelation of the Tuskegee study correlated with decreased life expectancy and lower utilization of medical services among Black men. The study created a justified suspicion of medical research and public health initiatives that persists to this day. When COVID-19 vaccines were developed, public health officials struggled to address vaccine hesitancy in Black communities, hesitancy that was directly linked to the legacy of Tuskegee. How could people be expected to trust government health officials when those same officials had, within living memory, deliberately allowed Black men to die from a treatable disease? In May 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. Standing in the White House with survivors of the study and their family members present, Clinton said, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It is not only in remembering that shameful past that we can make amends and repair our nation, but it is in remembering that past that we can build a better present and a better future." Clinton announced plans to establish the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare, dedicated to ensuring that what happened in Tuskegee could never happen again. But survivors and their families knew that an apology, while important, couldn't undo 40 years of suffering. Herman Shaw, one of the survivors, spoke at the ceremony. He had lived with syphilis for decades, had watched friends and family members die from the disease, had been denied treatment that could have saved them all. He accepted the apology with grace, but he also made clear that remembering what happened wasn't enough. The medical community, the government, and society as a whole needed to actively work to rebuild trust and ensure that no community would ever again be treated as expendable in the name of science. The last known survivor of the Tuskegee Syphilis study died in 2004. But the legacy of the study remains. It's taught in medical schools as a cautionary tale about what happens when researchers lose sight of the humanity of their subjects. It's invoked in discussions about informed consent and research ethics. And it stands as a permanent reminder that medical research, no matter how well-intentioned, can become monstrous when it treats people as means to an end rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and care. The Tuskegee Syphilis study represents one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, a 40-year betrayal of trust that was all the more devastating because it was committed not by rogues or outliers, but by respected institutions with the full knowledge and approval of the medical establishment. The men of Macon County were poor, they were Black, and they were treated as if their lives and their suffering didn't matter. Science gained some knowledge about the progression of untreated syphilis, but the cost was measured in ruined lives, in children born sick, in families destroyed, and in a legacy of mistrust that may never fully heal. In August 1971, a psychology professor at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo created a prison in the basement of the psychology department building. It wasn't a real prison, of course. It was a simulation, an experiment designed to study how people behave when assigned to roles of power or powerlessness. 24 male college students, all healthy and psychologically stable, had volunteered to participate in what they thought would be a 2-week study of prison life. They were randomly assigned to play either guards or prisoners, and Zimbardo made the simulation as realistic as possible. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual police officers who had agreed to assist with the experiment. They were brought to the makeshift prison, where they were stripped, searched, and given uniforms. Each prisoner was issued a dress-like smock, and a chain was locked around one ankle. They were given numbers instead of names, and were referred to only by those numbers. The guards wore khaki uniforms, carried wooden batons, and wore reflecting sunglasses so the prisoners couldn't make eye contact with them. Zimbardo instructed the guards to maintain order in the prison and to create an atmosphere where the prisoners felt powerless. He made clear that the guards could not physically harm the prisoners, but otherwise gave them broad latitude in how they maintained control. Some guards took this instruction as permission to exercise their authority creatively and with increasing cruelty. On the first day, not much happened. The guards and prisoners were all still figuring out their roles, still treating the experiment like what it was, a study. But by the second day, everything changed. The prisoners staged a rebellion, barricading themselves in their cells and taunting the guards. The guards, feeling their authority challenged, responded with force. They used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the doors. They stripped the prisoners naked. They took away their beds. They established a system of rewards and punishments to break the solidarity among the prisoners. From that point forward, the simulation took on a life of its own. The guards, who just days before had been college students with no particular inclination toward violence or cruelty, began behaving in ways that shocked everyone observing the experiment. Some guards became sadistic, inventing increasingly creative and humiliating ways to assert their dominance over the prisoners. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, while other prisoners sat on their backs. They made prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. They subjected them to sexual humiliation, forcing prisoners to simulate sexual acts with each other. They used sleep deprivation as a punishment, waking prisoners throughout the night for meaningless head counts. The prisoners, meanwhile, began to break down. Some showed signs of acute anxiety and emotional distress. They cried. They raged. One prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash all over his body. Another began acting erratically, screaming and sobbing uncontrollably. One prisoner had to be released after just 36 hours because of uncontrollable bursts of screaming, crying, and anger. Within the first 4 days, 3 prisoners had become so traumatized they were released from the experiment. What was perhaps most disturbing was how thoroughly both guards and prisoners had internalized their roles. The prisoners began referring to themselves by number. They accepted the degrading treatment. Even when they had opportunities to leave the simulation, some prisoners chose to stay, as if they had forgotten this was just an experiment they could quit at any time. The guards, meanwhile, continued to escalate their abuse, even when there were no observers present. They weren't performing cruelty for the researchers' benefit. They had become cruel. Zimbardo himself became so immersed in his role as prison superintendent that he lost his objectivity as a researcher. He was actively managing the prison, making decisions about how to handle the prisoners, responding to the guards' reports. When parents came to visit their sons during scheduled visiting hours, Zimbardo worried they might try to get their sons released and tried to make the prison look as legitimate as possible to discourage them from interfering. When one prisoner asked to be released and Zimbardo told him he'd consider it, but wanted him to think about it overnight, the prisoner responded as if he were actually in a real prison, as if he needed permission to leave, forgetting entirely that he could walk out any time he wanted. It was Zimbardo's graduate student and girlfriend, Christina Maslach, who finally forced him to see what was happening. On the night of day 5, she visited the simulated prison and watched as prisoners were led to the bathroom for their nighttime toilet run, their bags over their heads and their legs chained together. She saw the complete dehumanization, saw that what was happening was no longer a scientific experiment, but something dark and cruel. She confronted Zimbardo, asking him what he thought he was doing, how he could let this continue. Her confrontation shook Zimbardo out of his role as superintendent and back into his role as researcher. He ended the experiment the next morning, after 6 days instead of the planned 14. When he gathered everyone together to explain why the experiment was ending, some of the guards seemed disappointed. They had been enjoying their power. Some of the prisoners wept with relief. In the immediate aftermath, the Stanford Prison Experiment was hailed as a groundbreaking demonstration of how situational forces can override individual personality traits. Zimbardo argued that the experiment proved ordinary people could become capable of terrible cruelty when placed in positions of power within an oppressive system. He suggested that the behavior of guards in real prisons, and by extension, the behavior of people in other authoritarian systems, wasn't the result of individual sadism, but of the roles and situations they found themselves in. The experiment became famous, cited in psychology textbooks, discussed in classes, referenced in conversations about human nature and the nature of evil. When photographs emerged in 2004 of American soldiers abusing prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, Zimbardo was quick to draw parallels to his experiment, arguing that the soldiers' behavior could be understood as a result of the same situational forces he had observed in his simulated prison. But in the decades since the experiment, serious questions have been raised about its validity and ethics. Critics have pointed out that the study had no control group, making it impossible to determine whether the observed behaviors were actually caused by the situation or by other factors. The sample size was small and limited to male college students, making it impossible to generalize the findings to the broader population. More damning are recent revelations about how much the experiment was manipulated. Thibault Letexier, a French researcher who gained access to the Stanford Prison Experiment archives, found evidence that the guards were explicitly coached by Zimbardo to behave in certain ways. They weren't simply reacting to their role as guards in a prison environment. They were following instructions from the researchers about how to create an atmosphere of oppression. Participants in the original experiment, interviewed decades later for a National Geographic documentary, confirmed many of Letexier's claims. Some of the guards admitted they were trying to give Zimbardo the results he wanted. Some of the prisoners admitted that they had exaggerated their distress, performing for the cameras because they thought that was what the experiment required. The dramatic breakdown of one prisoner, which had been presented as evidence of the experiment's powerful effect, was later revealed to have been at least partially faked, with the prisoner later admitting he had been trying to get out of the experiment so he could focus on studying for exams. The ethical concerns are even more serious. The prisoners were subjected to real psychological abuse. They experienced genuine distress, fear, and humiliation. Some carried psychological scars from the experience for years afterward. The experiment would never be approved by a university ethics board today. The deception involved, the lack of proper informed consent about what participants might be subjected to, the failure to protect participants from psychological harm, all of these represent serious ethical violations by modern standards. Zimbardo has defended the experiment against these criticisms, arguing that the core findings remain valid despite the methodological limitations. He points to the extensive debriefing sessions held with participants, the follow-up surveys conducted over the years, and the fact that no participants reported lasting psychological harm in those surveys. He argues that his critics are engaged in ad hominem attacks and are ignoring data that contradicts their arguments. But the damage to the Stanford Prison Experiment's reputation is severe. Many psychology departments have stopped teaching it as a straightforward demonstration of situational influence on behavior and now present it as a case study in how experiments can go wrong, how researchers can lose objectivity, and how findings that seem dramatic can be artifacts of experimental design rather than genuine insights into human nature. The broader question raised by the Stanford Prison Experiment and the subsequent controversy around it is what it tells us about power, authority, and human nature. If the guards were coached to behave cruelly, does that mean the experiment tells us nothing about how ordinary people can become abusive when given power? Or does it tell us something even more disturbing, that people are willing to commit acts of cruelty when given permission to do so by authority figures, even in a fake prison where they know they're being watched? The Stanford Prison Experiment stands as a cautionary tale on multiple levels. It's a story about what happens when researchers become so invested in their hypotheses that they lose their objectivity. It's a story about the ethics of human subject research and the importance of protecting participants from harm. And it's a story about how scientific findings that seem to reveal fundamental truths about human nature can turn out to be more complex, more contingent, and less universal than they first appear. Philip Zimbardo died in October 2024 at age 91, still defending his most famous experiment while acknowledging its flaws. But the experiment he conducted in the basement of Stanford University in 1971 remains controversial, its findings disputed, its methods questioned, its ethics condemned. Whether it was a groundbreaking demonstration of the power of social situations or a poorly controlled experiment that produced misleading results, it undeniably had a profound impact on psychology and on our cultural understanding of how ordinary people can do terrible things. On the night of April 25, 1986, in the city of Pripyat in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, children slept in their beds unaware that in a few hours their lives would change forever. Their parents worked normal jobs, attended normal schools, lived in normal apartment buildings. Pripyat was a relatively new city, built in the 1970s to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located just a few kilometers away. The city was modern, prosperous by Soviet standards, and young. The average age of residents was 26. It was a place where people came to build futures. At the nuclear power plant, the night shift was preparing for a safety test on reactor number 4. The test was meant to determine whether, in the event of a power failure, the reactor's cooling system could continue operating using electricity generated by the residual spin of the turbines before backup diesel generators came online. It was a reasonable question to ask. In an emergency, every second would matter, and understanding whether the turbines could buy a crucial extra minute or two of cooling could be the difference between a manageable situation and a catastrophe. But the test, which should have been conducted during the day shift with senior personnel present, had been delayed. By the time the reactor was ready, it was late at night. The day shift had gone home. The evening shift was preparing to leave. The night shift, which hadn't been prepared or briefed for the test, would have to carry it out, and the man overseeing the test, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, was determined to proceed despite the late hour and the fact that the crew wasn't properly prepared. To conduct the test, the operators had to put the reactor into a specific low-power state. But as they reduced power, something went wrong. The power level dropped much lower than intended, plummeting to just 30 megawatts instead of the 700 they were aiming for. This created a dangerous condition. At very low power, the RBMK reactor design had a critical flaw. Under these conditions, attempting to shut down the reactor by inserting the control rods could actually cause a brief spike in power instead of a decrease. The operators should have aborted the test at this point, but Dyatlov ordered them to continue. They withdrew most of the control rods from the core, trying to bring the power back up to acceptable levels for the test. This left the reactor in a highly unstable state, poised on a knife's edge between shutdown and runaway reaction. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26th, the operators initiated the test. They shut down the turbine, and as planned, the turbine's residual spin continued to generate electricity. But it wasn't enough to fully power the cooling water pumps. Without adequate cooling, the water in the reactor began to boil more vigorously. This created steam voids in the cooling channels, and in the RBMK reactor design, more steam meant more reactivity. The power level began to rise rapidly. The operators saw what was happening and hit the emergency shutdown button, which should have inserted all 200 control rods into the reactor at once, stopping the chain reaction. But the control rods had a fatal design flaw. Their tips were made of graphite, which increased rather than decreased reactivity. So for a few critical seconds, as the graphite tips entered the core before the neutron-absorbing material could follow, the reactor's power level didn't decrease. It exploded upward. Within 4 seconds, the reactor's power level increased to more than 100 times its normal operating level. The fuel rods shattered. The coolant water flashed to steam. The pressure inside the reactor vessel became immense. At 1:23 and 44 seconds, 2 massive explosions tore reactor number 4 apart. The first was likely a steam explosion, the water flashing to steam so rapidly that it blew apart the pressure vessel. The second, seconds later, was likely a hydrogen explosion, the superheated fuel reacting with what remained of the cooling water to produce massive amounts of hydrogen gas that ignited explosively. The explosions blew the 1,000-ton concrete and steel lid off the reactor like a coin being flipped. Chunks of burning radioactive material were hurled into the air. The graphite moderator blocks in the reactor core, exposed to air and heated to incredible temperatures, began to burn. Radioactive smoke billowed into the night sky, carrying with it isotopes of iodine, cesium, strontium, plutonium, and dozens of other radioactive elements. In the control room, the operators watched in horror as their instruments failed. Systems went offline, and alarms screamed warnings that no one could fully comprehend. Some of the men refused to believe what was happening. They insisted the reactor was still intact, that it couldn't possibly have been destroyed. Even as burning fuel fell around the plant and radiation alarms maxed out, some operators maintained that the reactor core must still be there, that this was some kind of equipment malfunction causing false readings. But in the plant itself, workers were seeing the reality. They saw the destroyed reactor hull, the fires burning on what remained of the roof, the glowing remains of the reactor core exposed to the open air, and they were being exposed to radiation levels that would kill them. Some of the men who fought the fires that night, or who entered the plant to try to assess the damage, received doses in the thousands of Roentgens. Within hours, they would be vomiting. Within days, their skin would be red and blistered. Within weeks, many of them would be dead. The nearby city of Pripyat was not immediately evacuated. The authorities didn't alert the residents during the night about what had happened. People woke up on the morning of April 26th and went about their normal routines, unaware that the air they were breathing and the ground they walked on were contaminated with radioactive material. Children played outside in what appeared to be normal spring weather. Some residents who looked towards the power plant could see strange lights and smoke, but didn't understand what it meant. But within hours, people began falling ill. Severe headaches, metallic tastes in their mouths, uncontrollable coughing and vomiting. These were the early symptoms of acute radiation sickness, though most people didn't realize that's what they were experiencing. The Soviet government, desperate to control information about what had happened, didn't immediately share details even with local officials. The government of Ukraine wasn't promptly informed about the accident at the plant that was on its territory. It wasn't until more than 24 hours after the explosion that evacuation of Pripyat began. Residents were told they would be gone for approximately 3 days, just long enough for authorities to deal with a small problem at the plant. They were instructed to bring only essential items. Most people left behind nearly all of their possessions, expecting to return in a few days. They never would. Pripyat became a ghost city, frozen in time, a place where clocks stopped and calendars remained on April 26, 1986. By that evening, 53,000 people had been evacuated from Pripyat to the Kiev region. Over the following days and weeks, the evacuation zone was expanded, first to 10 kilometers, then to 30 kilometers around the plant. Ultimately, approximately 350,000 people would be permanently relocated from the most heavily contaminated areas. The immediate death toll was surprisingly low. 2 workers died in the explosion itself. In the 3 months following the accident, 28 more people died from acute radiation syndrome. These were mostly firefighters and plant workers who had been exposed to extraordinarily high radiation levels in the hours after the explosion. But the true human cost of Chernobyl would take decades to fully understand. The radioactive contamination from Chernobyl spread far beyond Ukraine. The burning graphite fire continued for days, pumping radioactive material into the atmosphere. Winds carried this contamination across Europe. Elevated radiation levels were detected in Sweden, Finland, Poland, and other countries hundreds of miles away. Farmland was contaminated. Livestock had to be destroyed. Milk was poured out. Vegetables were left to rot in the fields. In the years following the accident, thousands of cases of thyroid cancer appeared in children who had been exposed to radioactive iodine, particularly in Belarus, which received heavy fallout from Chernobyl. About 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer have been attributed to Chernobyl exposure, with 15 resulting in death. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation estimated that fewer than 100 deaths could be directly attributed to radiation from the accident, though projections of eventual cancer deaths from the exposure run much higher, with some estimates suggesting several thousand additional cancer deaths may occur among the exposed population over their lifetimes. The psychological and social impacts were perhaps even more devastating than the immediate health effects. Entire communities were displaced. People lost their homes, their jobs, their way of life. The trauma of forced evacuation, the fear of radiation exposure, the uncertainty about health effects, all of this took a profound psychological toll. Studies found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide among those affected by the disaster. The cleanup operation, involving over 500,000 workers called liquidators, was an extraordinary and dangerous undertaking. Workers constructed a concrete and steel sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor to contain the radioactive material still inside. This structure was completed in less than 6 months under extraordinarily hazardous conditions. Workers had to take turns doing jobs that exposed them to lethal radiation levels, working for just minutes at a time before being replaced by another crew to limit their exposure. Many of these liquidators received doses high enough to cause long-term health problems. The economic cost of Chernobyl is estimated at approximately $700 billion, making it the most expensive disaster in history. The costs include not just the immediate response and cleanup, but decades of ongoing expenses for managing the contaminated areas, providing health care for affected populations, and dealing with the long-term consequences of the disaster. The causes of the Chernobyl disaster were complex. A combination of design flaws in the RBMK reactor, poor safety culture, inadequate training, and violations of operating procedures. The International Nuclear Safety Advisory Group's initial report blamed the operators for the accident, but a revised report 7 years later placed primary responsibility on the reactor's design flaws, while acknowledging that an inadequate safety culture at all levels contributed to the disaster. The RBMK reactor had several critical design flaws. The positive void coefficient meant that loss of coolant could cause the reaction to accelerate rather than slow down. The control rod design, with graphite tips, meant that inserting the rods to shut down the reactor could temporarily increase reactivity, and the lack of a containment structure meant that when the reactor exploded, there was nothing to contain the radioactive release. But beyond these technical issues, Chernobyl revealed profound institutional problems. There was a culture that prioritized production over safety. There was poor communication between those running the test and those responsible for reactor safety. There was inadequate training that left operators unprepared for the conditions they encountered. There was a hierarchical structure that discouraged workers from questioning orders even when those orders seemed dangerous. Chernobyl changed the nuclear power industry worldwide. Safety protocols were strengthened. Reactor designs were improved. International cooperation on nuclear safety was enhanced. The disaster led to the creation of new conventions on early notification of nuclear accidents and international assistance in case of nuclear emergencies. The International Atomic Energy Agency's role in nuclear safety was strengthened. But Chernobyl also dealt a severe blow to nuclear power's reputation. In many countries, plans for new nuclear plants were canceled or indefinitely delayed. Public fear of nuclear power increased dramatically. The disaster seemed to confirm the worst fears of nuclear critics, that atomic energy was inherently too dangerous, that the consequences of a major accident were too severe to accept any level of risk. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains. The area within 30 kilometers of the plant is largely abandoned, though some people, mostly elderly, have returned illegally to live in their former homes. The zone has become an accidental nature preserve, with wildlife populations rebounding in the absence of human habitation despite elevated radiation levels. The original sarcophagus built over Reactor 4 has been replaced with a new, larger containment structure, completed in 2016. The other 3 reactors at Chernobyl continued operating until the year 2000, when the last one was shut down. The disaster at Chernobyl stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when complex technological systems fail, when safety is compromised, when warnings are ignored. It was an accident that didn't have to happen, caused by decisions made by people who underestimated the risks they were taking and overestimated their ability to control the forces they were working with. A safety test meant to make the plant safer, instead destroyed it and created a catastrophe whose effects are still being felt nearly 40 years later. In the late 1950s, a new drug appeared in pharmacies across Europe, marketed as a safe and effective treatment for a range of ailments, but particularly promoted for pregnant women suffering from morning sickness. The drug was called Thalidomide, and it seemed like a miracle. Unlike many sedatives of the era, which could be dangerous in overdose, Thalidomide appeared remarkably safe. Tests on animals hadn't shown any serious toxic effects. People taking the drug reported few side effects. It was being prescribed to millions of people for insomnia, anxiety, and nausea. In Germany, where the drug was manufactured by a company called Chemie Grünenthal, Thalidomide was available over the counter. You didn't even need a prescription. Pregnant women took it freely, believing it was harmless. Doctors recommended it enthusiastically. The company promoted it aggressively, suggesting it was so safe that even pregnant women and children could take it without worry. But toward the end of the 1950s, something strange started happening. Doctors in Germany began noticing an unusual number of babies being born with severe malformations. The most striking of these was phocomelia, a condition where the long bones of the arms and legs are severely shortened or absent, making the hands or feet appear to be attached directly to the trunk of the body. It was an extremely rare birth defect, occurring perhaps once in many thousands of births. But suddenly, multiple babies with phocomelia were being born in the same hospitals, sometimes within days of each other. Other birth defects were appearing with unusual frequency as well. Babies were born with absent or malformed internal organs, with heart defects, with damaged eyes and ears, sometimes completely lacking external ears, with facial abnormalities. The range of defects was staggering, and they were appearing with a frequency that couldn't be explained by chance. Doctors struggled to understand what was causing this sudden epidemic of birth defects. Some suggested it might be related to nuclear testing, that radiation from atmospheric nuclear tests was causing mutations. Others proposed various environmental causes. But 2 doctors, working independently, began to suspect that a common factor among the affected babies was that their mothers had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. In Australia, an obstetrician named William McBride noticed that several babies born under his care at Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney had severe malformations, and their mothers had all taken thalidomide. A midwife named Sister Pat Sparrow had been the first to suspect the connection. McBride began investigating and became convinced that thalidomide was causing the birth defects. He succeeded in getting the hospital to stop prescribing the drug to pregnant women in June 1961 and wrote to the medical journal, The Lancet, describing his findings. In Germany, a pediatrician named Widukind Lenz was seeing similar patterns. He conducted surveys of parents whose children had been born with malformations and found that approximately 20% had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. When he specifically asked all parents about thalidomide use, half of them reported having taken the drug. On November 15, 1961, Lenz reported his findings to Kemi Grunenthal. 5 days later, at a pediatric conference, he publicly announced his suspicion that thalidomide was causing birth defects. The company initially resisted these claims. They argued that not all women who took thalidomide had babies with birth defects, and that some women whose babies were affected claimed they hadn't taken the drug. They suggested other causes must be responsible. But as the evidence mounted, they could no longer deny the connection. On November 26, 1961, Kemi Grunenthal withdrew thalidomide from the German market. Other countries quickly followed. By that time, the damage was done. The total number of babies affected by thalidomide is estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 worldwide. Approximately 40% died at or shortly after birth. Those who survived faced a lifetime of challenges. The severity and type of defects depended on precisely when during pregnancy the mother had taken the drug. Thalidomide was most dangerous between the 20th and 36th days after conception, a critical period for limb and organ development. The window was precise and cruel. Taking thalidomide on day 20 of pregnancy could cause central brain damage. Day 21 would damage the eyes. Day 22, the ears and face. Day 24, the arms. Leg damage occurred if the drug was taken up to day 28. Many women took thalidomide during this period without even knowing they were pregnant, as it often occurs before a missed period would alert them to their condition. The thalidomide disaster was made worse by several factors. The drug had not been tested on pregnant animals, a critical oversight that would later prompt major changes in drug testing protocols. When animal tests were eventually done after the link to birth defects was discovered, they showed that thalidomide did cause malformations in several species, but only if the tests were conducted properly. Early animal studies had failed to detect the problem, partly because many species give birth at night and will cannibalize offspring born with deformities. When technicians arrived in the morning, they would see only healthy babies and conclude the drug was safe. Additionally, some early animal tests had dissolved thalidomide in water or other solutions to inject it, but the active ingredients in thalidomide break down in solution, so those tests also failed to show the drug's harmful effects. It wasn't until proper tests were conducted, with the drug given in tablet form during the critical period of pregnancy, and with careful monitoring including cesarean sections to examine all offspring, that the full teratogenic effects became clear. The suffering caused by thalidomide extended far beyond the physical disabilities. Families were devastated by having children with severe malformations they were unprepared to care for. Many children required multiple surgeries throughout their lives. Some needed extensive physical therapy and adaptive equipment to achieve any degree of independence. The psychological and social impacts were enormous. Children faced staring, discrimination, and struggles with self-esteem. Parents dealt with guilt, grief, and the enormous financial and emotional burden of caring for severely disabled children. And in many cases, the companies responsible for distributing thalidomide fought viciously against compensating the victims. In the United Kingdom, the Distillers Company, which had marketed thalidomide, initially offered settlements so inadequate that they sparked public outrage. In Germany, Kemi Grunenthal denied responsibility for years. Families had to wage long legal battles just to get recognition that the drug had caused their children's disabilities, much less adequate compensation. It took a high-profile campaign led by the Sunday Times newspaper in the United Kingdom in the 1970s to finally secure better compensation for British victims. Even then, many families felt that no amount of money could make up for what had been done to their children, and in some countries, Particularly in South America and Japan, thalidomide survivors received little or no compensation at all. One of the few bright spots in the thalidomide story is the role of Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, a reviewer at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. When the pharmaceutical company Richardson Merrill applied to sell thalidomide in the United States in 1960, Dr. Kelsey was assigned to review the application. She found the company's data inadequate and incomplete. She noted reports from the United Kingdom of patients developing peripheral neuritis, a nerve condition, after taking thalidomide. She had concerns about whether the drug had been properly tested. Despite enormous pressure from Richardson Merrill, which was eager to get the drug approved and on the market, Dr. Kelsey refused to approve the application. She kept requesting more data, raising new questions, insisting on better evidence of safety. Her actions delayed approval long enough that by the time the evidence of birth defects emerged from Europe, thalidomide had not yet been approved for general sale in the United States. Because of Dr. Kelsey's diligence, the United States was largely spared the thalidomide disaster. While approximately 20,000 patients in the U.S. had received the drug as part of clinical trials before it was pulled, and some babies were born with thalidomide-related birth defects in America, the number was far lower than it would have been if the drug had been approved for general use. Dr. Kelsey became a hero, awarded the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service by President John F. Kennedy. The thalidomide disaster led to major reforms in drug regulation worldwide. In the United States, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1962, requiring that drugs be proven both safe and effective before approval. Drug companies had to conduct rigorous testing, including tests on pregnant animals, to detect potential birth defects. More comprehensive informed consent was required for clinical trials. Adverse event reporting requirements were strengthened. Other countries implemented similar reforms. The entire process of drug development and approval became more stringent, more expensive, and more time-consuming. While this means potentially beneficial drugs take longer to reach patients, it also means that disasters like thalidomide are less likely to occur. Tragically, the thalidomide story didn't end in the 1960s. The drug was later found to have legitimate medical uses. It's effective in treating certain complications of leprosy and is used in combination with other drugs to treat multiple myeloma, a type of cancer. When thalidomide was reintroduced for these uses, strict programs were put in place to prevent exposure during pregnancy, including mandatory pregnancy tests, requirements for multiple forms of contraception, and registries to track all patients receiving the drug. But despite these safeguards, a new generation of thalidomide babies has been born, particularly in Brazil, where the drug is used to treat leprosy. In areas with poor medical oversight and inadequate enforcement of safety protocols, women have taken thalidomide during pregnancy and given birth to children with the same characteristic birth defects seen in the 1960s. As of recent estimates, there are hundreds of thalidomide survivors in Brazil, children born decades after the drug's dangers were well established, suffering because safety measures that work in developed countries failed in resource-poor settings. The thalidomide disaster remains one of the clearest examples of how drugs can have unexpected and devastating effects, how inadequate testing can lead to tragedy, and how the drive to bring products to market can lead companies to downplay or ignore warning signs. It's taught in medical schools and pharmacy schools as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough testing, careful monitoring, and honest communication about risks. For the survivors, many now in their 60s, thalidomide has defined their lives in ways both limiting and empowering. Many have faced lifelong physical challenges, undergone numerous surgeries, dealt with pain and disability. But many have also become advocates, speaking out about their experiences, fighting for compensation and recognition, and working to ensure that what happened to them doesn't happen to others. They've built lives and families despite the obstacles they faced. They've challenged perceptions about disability and demonstrated remarkable resilience. The thalidomide story is ultimately about the cost of rushing to market, the dangers of inadequate testing, and the importance of regulatory oversight. It's about what happens when profit is prioritized over safety, when warning signs are ignored, when companies are more concerned with defending their products than protecting consumers. And it's a reminder that even drugs that seem safe, that pass initial tests, that are widely used without apparent problems, can hide terrible dangers that only emerge under specific conditions. The children born with thalidomide-related birth defects were innocent victims of a system that failed them at every level, from the company that produced an inadequately tested drug, to the regulators who approved it, to the doctors who prescribed it without knowing its dangers. Their suffering led to reforms that have made drug development safer, but those reforms came too late for the tens of thousands of babies who were born with severe disabilities because their mothers took a pill they were told was safe. These stories, spanning decades and continents, share common threads. They all involved experiments or treatments conducted by people who believed they were advancing science or helping humanity. They all involved a failure to adequately protect the people who became subjects of these experiments, and they all led to reforms designed to prevent similar disasters in the future. But perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that science, for all its power to improve human life, must always be tempered by ethics, by respect for human dignity, and by a recognition that the ends, no matter how noble, cannot justify means that cause suffering. The progress of knowledge is important, but it can never be more important than the individual human lives that make that progress possible. The Demon Corps taught us about the dangers of overconfidence and insufficient safety protocols. Jesse Gelsinger's death revealed the perils of conflicts of interest and inadequate informed consent. The Radium Girls exposed how companies can knowingly sacrifice workers' health for profit. Tuskegee showed us the depths of medical racism and the necessity of informed consent. The Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrated how easily research can slip into abuse when oversight is lacking. Chernobyl revealed the catastrophic consequences of inadequate safety culture, and thalidomide proved that seemingly safe drugs can hide terrible dangers. Each of these cases led to reforms, to new regulations, to changed practices. But each also left behind victims who paid the price for those lessons. As we continue to push the boundaries of science and medicine, we must remember these stories and the people who suffered. We must ensure that in our pursuit of knowledge, we never lose sight of our obligation to protect those who trust us with their health, their bodies, and their lives. If you found these stories as fascinating and sobering as I did, please consider subscribing to this channel. And if you have thoughts about these cases or know of other experiments that went terribly wrong, leave a comment below. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and most importantly, stay safe.